Right now, the Pentagon trying to figure out what to do when it comes to Syria. The president, he's threatened airstrikes after the latest round of chemical weapons were used, we believe, by the Syrian government. But Defense Secretary Mattis says they're still looking into, in effect, who the perpetrators were. Now, a year ago, the U.S., as you know, shot Tomahawk missiles into Syria after it used chemical weapons. But since then, things have actually gotten worse and even more complicated. The question is, are there any good options? His retired Army captain served in Iraq. And Mike,
hey, Larry.
It just seems with Syria that the choices range from bad to worse, especially if we want perceptible change to happen. Last year, I think with broad national support, the president called for, and we had limited strikes. You can argue little, if anything's really changed. They didn't have the deterrent effect on Assad, and here we are right again. So I'm going to go through options here, at least as and you tell me if I'm missing any, and then you tell me the upside and the downside. We could do 2.0. Again, limited strikes, targeted, whether it's runways or something else. But given the Russian presence there and Iranian support, the argument is it'll make us feel good, but it won't really change anything. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think anything that we do similar to what we did last time will change anything on the ground, won't change his behavior. We went after the airstrips that the chemical attack was launched from, and it was back in operation within 48 hours. We might have taken out some military assets. I think we've always got to be careful when we launch missiles inside a sovereign country. Casualties, regardless. I mean, we tipped off the Russians that we were doing it. And we see this time the Russians are moving some of their military assets already. They're trying to harden them. But from that perspective, 2.0, I think, to your point, makes us feel good. I don't think it gets us any results. I don't know what it adds to the strategic value of what we're trying to do inside of Syria.
Now, under the last administration, we armed the rebels, especially with these anti-aircraft, these TOW or TOW weaponry. Apparently really effective. Some argue even too effective because the Russians then came in and basically upgraded in significant ways the Syria capabilities. What about that? Is that chapter already closed or not?
Well, that chapter's closed because Syria really exists of 5 different wars that are happening in 5 different geographies around the country. And we're nowhere near inside this geography, anywhere near Damascus, Homs. We're not in that spot. We only can arm rebels when we get soldiers close enough to do that. Now, the soldiers we have inside of Syria right now are in an area called Al-Dazor to the east of where this is, well east, and in one of the most desolate places in the world. So they're not going to have any impact on that as well. There's fighting that's taking place to the north and to the north and to the west. But the bottom line is there's nobody we can arm. And in fact, the group that is fighting the government there, we don't even know much about. So that's not an option. We couldn't parachute ammunition and stuff into them, which is what it takes during the Civil War. Someone comes in the side of one or the other to tip the balance in their favor. In this case, you've got the Russians and the Iranians coming in the side of the Syrian government, which is why it's been virtually no match.
To that end, let's say the president wants to take a more ambitious approach than the limited strikes. And at least as he intimated it through Twitter, etc., look out Russians. Would we really consider going after, as you said, Russian-backed military assets? And obviously, the question is, the consequence could be this thing could get a lot bigger than just Syria.
Right. This could escalate very quickly. In the past 18 months, Russian military forces have virtually embedded themselves alongside Syrian forces for their own protection, knowing full well that if the United States did attack, there could be a possibility that they could be endangered as well. And that's why Russians have moved some of their assets. So if we go after other things, if we go after the Ministry of Defense, if we go after other military targets, let's say we try to take out their air defense capability. We're going to kill Syrian soldiers and we're going to kill Russians. There's no other way around it. The Russians know that. So I do believe that's what's causing the president to hesitate, because what's the Russian response to that? The platforms are going to be air and sea.
So we couldn't knock out the Syrian Air Force without realistically expecting there could be some Russian casualties as a consequence.
Right, and from their perspective, they would perceive it as an act of war. We've talked about this thing about a no-fly zone. Well, we'll just knock out their air defenses. That's an act of war if you're on the receiving side of that. There's going to be people killed. Those capabilities going. It's not as simple as just ordering it up on Amazon or so.
Yep.
And we live in this video game world where we just believe the Tomahawk missiles will solve this problem. They won't. You'd have to put pilots in cockpits, have them fly over Syria for hours at a time to get the kind of military damage assessment that would assure that they can't do anything more. Are we willing to put our pilots over Syria? I don't think so.
And also, even if we're successful, there's a concern, and you laid it out in terms of you have to pick a side, but if you don't have two sides to pick from, you're not going to help your enemy. If we even successfully toppled the Assad government,
right,
what would be left after it? We'd have millions more Syrians who are already in horrible situations, even plunged into more chaos.
Right. We haven't learned yet what regime change means and what it does to countries like Libya, like what it did to Iraq. And when I see Senator Graham, for example, talk about taking out Assad himself, first of all, that's possibly a war crime. We don't want to escalate to the point where we're going to assassinate a head of state. So again, the targets have got to be military related. There's all those things that got to go into it. But let's even take a step back. I get the fact that democratized countries in a post-World War II era want to punish a country that uses chemical weapons, and depending on what that is, I get that. But that should be talked about before, what that response is going to be. That response can't be just militarily. It's got to be economically, and it's got to be diplomatic. Let's have the Cuban Missile Crisis moment in the United Nations of the proof that it was the Assad government. Let them explain it and go from there.
And to that point, I thought it was really curious, Mike, that General Mattis, he made it not so uncertain yesterday that let's first prove, in effect, that it has Assad fingerprints on it, because Assad's one of the worst human beings on the planet, committing horrific war crimes in his direction, completely. But it made no logical sense at this stage, less than a week after the president shocking his own military advisors. Trump says, yeah, we're going to pull out of Syria. Why at that point would you use chemical weapons on your own people? I don't want to give Assad any benefit of the doubt. The world would be a better place without him. I agree with all that, except when Mattis says that, to me at least, and I'm not the military guy you are, it was a cool your jets for a second, Mr. President, here. Let's not leap before we look.
Yeah, and here's why, Rich, because
is that a fair read of it?
Absolutely, and here's why. What video that's come out of that situation on the ground by the white helmets of Damascus is, if you look on Twitter, you could see some of the video, and I've looked at that video, and they claim that these were chemical canisters used in the attack. Those were not chemical canisters. Those are illumination canisters. Those are not chemical weapons whatsoever. So, we tend to believe video, and we see it in today's world, but that's the problem right now. It still can't be verified that it's coming from the Assad government. If we can absolutely match the helicopter to the barrel bomb, to the whole thing, that's one thing. Let's, again, make that case in the United Nations. But I have a hard time believing these canisters on the ground that this one group says they find there coming from an artillery is the cause of that chemical weapon attack. So this is all part of, I think, the American mantra of it's got to be fair. If we're going to go strike somebody militarily and hit them hard, it's got to be fair.
Mike, thank you as always. I appreciate
Thanks,
it. All right, coming up next, everybody, he may be the most dangerous man in D.C., and I'm talking about Jim Comey. His book coming out, excerpts already. Well, they're pretty shocking. Fasten your seatbelts. We're going to give you what will be a bumpy ride for the White House in the coming days and weeks.